Yo, what's up? Welcome to day 28, Become a Great Investor. It's Monday, January 15th, and in this stream, probably gonna read a little bit about this book, Principles for Navigating Big Debt Crises. I think this right now is a pretty relevant book to read to understand how to look at debt and what this could mean. Because right now, the US is entering elevated debt levels that may be unsustainable in the long term. So I think, as a refresher, I have some note cards, flashcards I want to go through real quick, see what I can study a little bit, and then probably go back into the book. Alright, so reviewing big debt crises. Flashcards. So hopefully this is a good way for me to kind of reintroduce myself to some of the concepts here and then use that to frame what I'm reading. What are the two main long-term problems that emerge from debt cycles? Okay, this one, I'm forgetting. So I do think that debt cycles are self-reinforcing, and maybe that's a problem itself. Maybe elevated debt levels. Losses arise from expected debt service payments not being made. Reduction of lending and the spending that was financing going forward. Okay. So it seems like this. So losses that arise from payments not being made, and then also there's a reduction of lending. Okay. What is a beautiful deleveraging? So I think this is a phrase coined by Ray Dalio in the sense that when countries, nations, or entities leverage up, that means that they're taking on more debt, and the ratio of debt to other forms of capital, most notably equity, is getting higher. Beautiful deleveraging is a way for countries, I think, to be able to reduce the leverage on their balance sheet. So that means lowering the amount of debt on their balance sheet while simultaneously ensuring that inflation is rising at a consistent and sustainable pace, and also the economic activity, I think, that is caused by maybe reducing the amount of debt is not slowed. So I think maybe some of the levers that a company, or not a company, but a country has to control their level of debt is maybe I would think of two main things that they can do. So one, depending on whether or not the currency is issued, whether or not the debt is issued in a local currency that the country has power over. Power in the sense that the central bank regulates the interest rates and also the ability to print money in that local currency. So I think maybe printing more money allows the government to spend more money on paying back those debts. But then there's a risk of increasing the money supply and therefore increasing inflation. Then there's a second, I would say it would be austerity. So that's just a fancy word of saying spending less. A nation is able to spend less on public incentive programs and use more of that money to go towards paying off interest in debt. So let's see if that's somewhat similar. Haven't finished. This is a reduction in the debt to income ratios accompanied by acceptable inflation and growth rates. I think that's a good idea. What does it mean to write down debt? I think to write down debt just means that you're accepting a loss on the debts that you will not be able to recuperate the value in. So it's just a way of saying that you're incurring a loss on some portion of the debt. So agreeing to receive less on debt service payments, basically a creditor reducing the amount of money that debtor will pay. What are the 4 levers that policymakers can use when handling debt crises? Okay. So I think one is austerity, so spending less. Second is printing more money. Third, I don't know what that could be. Maybe spreading out the... How do you spread out the debt across the economy and also across time? So, austerity, debt default / restructuring. Money and credit from those who have more than those than they need to those who have less. Maybe that's the form of higher taxes. Marginal income tax. Can spreading out debt problems be harder for economies that have the debt denominated in foreign currencies? So I think that's true in the case that it is a bit harder for economies. I'm not 100% sure why the reason is, but I would like to think that's probably because it doesn't, the country that has debt outstanding that isn't denominated in its own currency, it can't print more money to actually pay off these debts. It has no control over the money supply. So it reduces their toolkits of levers they can pull. What are the potential trade-offs with tight and loose lending standards? So when you have tight lending standards, then you're really limiting the amount of credit that can be given to individuals, corporations, or other governments. And so with that, you might have lower write-downs, lower losses on debt, but there is a kind of cost to it in the sense that with the less credit available, it's more difficult to stimulate economic growth or to invest in, let's say, innovative projects. So I think these two benefits and drawbacks are swapped when it comes to loose lending standards. So you have a lot of credit being available to institutions. I think the economy and the SNL standards at NSL. It was something that I was looking at yesterday that had all of the information about how to measure economic growth. But one of the key things they mentioned, I think, standards national something. Let's see. Systems of national accounts. That's what it was. Okay. Oops. So in the systems of national accounts, they mention institutions as economies comprising of institutions. So institutions are going to be your financial institutions, non-financial, financial companies, non-financial companies, and then also, I think, governments and households. So how does that relate to this? Well, these are all of the people that are going to be the ones that will be lending or borrowing from each other. And so these are all the people that are going to be affected by the lending standards. cuts buying power in this case. Losses on debt, but would increase the economic benefit from having more buying power. Valuable economic projects. Even though debt crises are well managed, can they still be costly people? Yeah, of course. I think one of the ways to manage debt crises that Dalio mentions is to spread out the cost of debts across time and across people, but some people are still going to be affected and may lose jobs, may lose some of key assets like housing, cars, transportation. How should one consider whether more credit is desirable? Maybe it depends on whether or not. So I guess the marginal utility or what the utility of debt is. So what the benefits will be from taking on more debts and what the current balance sheet already looks like for whoever wants to take on more debt. I'm so tired. How can too little on credit be a bad thing? It can be a bad thing because with too little credit, then you're not really funding innovative entrepreneurs. You're not funding different businesses to keep their companies going. And so you're really limiting the economy and economic production. Why do debt crises typically happen? This is a good question, actually. I'm not too sure what the exact reasons why. I'm going to be honest, I kind of forgot. But I think some of the things that might cause a debt crisis is really high elevated debt levels. Also, maybe a slowdown in economic activity, although that might be a byproduct of debt crises. Debt and its related servicing costs rise faster than the incomes that are needed to service them. This causes a deleveraging, lowering the amount of debt relative to... Okay, so maybe looking at debt to income is really important. But I'm so tired, I'm just going to take a nap here for a second. Sometimes days don't always go your way. Better. Something better. Back from my little sleep nap. So debts and its related servicing costs rise faster than the incomes that are needed to service them. This creates a deleveraging, lowering the amount of debt relative to income. There are two main long-term problems that emerge from debt cycles. One of them is the losses that arise from debts. And then because there are losses, there are also people that are less willing to lend. There might not be a cause-effect relationship, but I think there's a big correlation between the two. What is a beautiful deleveraging? So beautiful deleveraging is the reduction of debts, say within a country, but your country is able to sustain inflation and growth rates. That's income ratio. Acceptable inflation and growth rates. Four levers that policymakers can use when handling debt crises. One lever, printing more money. Second, austerity. Third, restructuring debts. Fourth, also moving resources from those who have a lot to those who don't have a lot. Even though debt crises are well managed, can they still be costly to people? Yeah. What are the downside risk of having high levels of debt? What does the downside risk of high levels of debt depend on? I think it depends on how well policymakers are able to spread the level of debt or the repayment of debt across history, across time, and across the economy. Spread out the losses of rising debts. Spread out losses of rising debts. What is the usual differentiating factor between mild recessions to harsher depressions? I think with mild recessions, countries are able to utilize the tools in their toolkits to be able to fight off this recession. So that could be lowering interest rates, printing more money. But I think maybe the biggest one has to do with interest rates. And so with harder depressions, I think this occurs whenever a country has utilized all of its tools in its toolkits, and there is nothing more for the country to do except for to spend less and to really try to incentivize people to countries to work, and also creates financial opportunities. So I think biggest thing is interest rates. In harsher depressions, countries don't have control over the interest rates, meaning that it's probably already close to zero. Okay. Increases the availability of credit to stimulate the economy. This usually leads to increasing the amount of debts in the economy as a byproduct of easy access credit. This usually leads to a deleveraging, reduction in defaults. I see. Yes, they need to reduce the amount of debts in order to sustain. In order to be sustainable. What are the political implications for debts? I think in terms of politics, it's a lot easier to take on more debt instead of trying to pay off debt. So that means increase spending instead of decreasing spending. Keep spending or increase spending. Oh. Easy credit then tighter credit too. What affects the ability of policymakers to spread out the losses on bad debts through time or through the nation? Okay, I think this is important. I think it relies upon whether or not the policymaker has control of the security of the underlying currency in which the debt is denominated. I think maybe increasing the I think so increasing the money supply is maybe a good way of spreading out losses on bad debts through time. Because what you're doing is you're effectively printing more money to take care of short-term costs, but you're also increasing the money supply and causing inflation to rise. Maybe making it cheaper to pay back the existing debt in the future. Whether policymakers have influence over how creditors and debtors behave with each other. When does debt servicing costs tend to outpace, become higher than the debt level? When does debt servicing costs tend to fall behind, become lower than the debt level? So maybe when debt servicing costs are higher when interest rates are relatively high. I'm not too sure exactly. Okay, interest rates are really high. Right, so I guess I was right originally. So interest rates are high, the cost of debt servicing outpaced the rise in debt levels due to the high cost of borrowing. Okay, 1980s. Due to low cost of borrowing. What is a classic warning sign of a bubble? Classic warning sign of bubble. So what is a bubble in the first place? A bubble is, I think, the idea of when people have unrealistic expectations of future growth rates. And maybe a classic warning sign of that happening is debt levels that are higher than income. Let's see. Okay, never mind. An increasing amount of money is borrowed to service pay off existing debts, which compounds the borrower's indebtedness. How many long-term debt crises has the U.S. gone through? What are they? I think maybe 2. So the Great Depression and the Great Recession, 2008. Great Depression, 1930s. (2008) 1930s. Boom, the early 2000s. The financial crisis starting in 2000. How can we simply describe the idea of a cycle through borrowing money? The idea of a cycle through borrowing money. Okay, so cycle is just something that happens over and over again, and it seems like the things that happen within the cycle might cause some sort of chain reaction. So when we think about borrowing money, then what actually happens is an institution will borrow money from, let's say, a financial institution or another institution. It'll choose to use that money towards maybe making some investment towards a project. And that project is going to fund the wages. It's also going to fund the materials that are used, which is going to create some economic output. And because of this economic output, people are going to become a little bit richer, a little bit more resourceful. And so with the excess money, people are able to borrow a little bit more, and it also allows other people who didn't have access to resources to borrow now. And so they end up borrowing and then create their own projects that creates economic development. And so this quickly resembles a cycle. As people borrow, spend, economic development, more people borrow, spend, more economic development. Okay, this I feel like is a weird description of how to describe this. This is hard right now. Why do debt crises usually happen? Why do debt crises typically happen? I think they typically happen because the debt levels are unsustainable levels, meaning that the ratio of debt to income is probably way too high. Okay, debts and its related servicing costs rise faster than the incomes that are needed to service them. Okay. When I say it's hard, not fully yet. Why are emerging economies susceptible to large cyclical swings? A lot of emerging economies have these debt-fueled projects that drive a lot of economic development within an emerging economy itself. And so the cyclical swings come from the demand and supply dynamics within the countries that relate to these big economic development projects. And so what I mean by this, just as an example, is let's say a country, an emerging economy, it needs some power. It needs to develop its infrastructure. So a power plant is going to create a lot of economic development. It's going to create jobs. It's going to create demand for raw materials. It's also going to create I guess maybe those two are the biggest ones that I can think of right now. Maybe there's some other thing. It also create economic opportunity, I think. But that might take a while to actually manifest. When these projects are built, usually that satisfies the demand for whatever the fixed assets is supposed to supply. So in this case, power plant supplies power. You really don't need more power besides one more power plant. And so the demand for another project kind of wanes a little bit, it decreases, and therefore all these people that were employed, all of the raw material and labor and capital that went into this project, it's going to shrink a little bit or be completely eliminated. And so that's why these emerging economies have large cyclical swings, times where there are demands for large projects. The economy does really well, but when there are no demands for projects, or mostly this happens when projects finish, then there are going to be less economic activity. There's going to be less economic activity. A lot of real estate and infrastructure development that is usually fueled by debt financing. In emerging economies, these projects tend to represent a large amount of economic activity relative to other parts of the economy. Okay. So it's good-ish. How does Ray Dalio compare long-term debt crises with short-term debt crises? I think the long-term debt crises are usually accompanied by depressions as opposed to short-term debt crises, which are accompanied by recessions. And we thought about the difference between depression and recession. It's really the ability of central banks to control interest rates. That's the biggest thing. Effectiveness of monetary policy. Okay. Less effectiveness of monetary policy. What type of behavior does lending have? It has a self-reinforcing upwards and downwards behavior. Okay. What type of lenders typically face the most pressure when bad debts start to accumulate? This is a question that's may seem kind of obvious maybe. So usually the lenders that face the most pressure are those who have most exposure to the bad debts. Maybe it's people that have lower credit scores or have high credit risk. I guess that lending institutions are highly leveraged and have a high exposure to customers that can't pay their loan backs. And they themselves are borrowing. Okay. What are the political implications for debt? Debt is a lot easier, or I guess tight credit is politically harder than having easy credit. Okay, another way of saying this is that constituents, maybe politicians, believe that it's easier to appeal to constituents by having looser credit conditions versus tighter. What is the usual differentiating factor between mild recessions to harsher depressions? Usually it's the ability for central banks to control interest rates. usually do not have to believe. Okay, so the reason why, though, of being able to use the interest lever is that decreasing interest rates increases the demand for borrowing. It allows the cost of debt or the cost of borrowing is less, so maybe more people are inclined to borrow. Who/what primarily controls the availability of credit? Central banks, probably, the government. Okay. What is the simple explanation to why lending has a self-reinforcing upward movement? What happens at the top of the cycle? So I think this is one of the reasons why lending kind of has this secular behavior, in the sense that it's similar to what I talked about earlier about circular motion of borrowing, or how borrowing quickly resembles a cycle. This cycle of borrowing increases future borrowing, which then increases future borrowing, which then increases future borrowing. And usually at the top of the cycle, you have this unsustainable level of debt to the amount of economic development in which the debt is producing. So maybe that's a high debt to GDP ratio, or maybe a high debt to income ratio. Borrowing lifts spending and income above the consistent growth of the economy. Yeah, that's unsustainable, yeah. What does debt servicing cost tend to outpace? Become higher than the debt level? So debt servicing costs, usually the cost of paying back debts comes in the form of interest and principal. They become higher than the debt level usually when interest rates are higher. They tend to fall, become lower than debt level when interest rates fall, or interest rates are low. I think that can be thought about in history, in the sense that in 1980s, I think, there was a big problem with inflation, and so interest rates rose. That caused the debt servicing cost to increase. I think warranted a deleveraging eventually. And in 2008, deleveraging occurred, and through that process, interest rates were brought down to zero. And then the amount of debts outstanding also declined as well. Servicing outpaced rate of debts rising levels due to the high cost of borrowing. Interest rates are really low post-US recession. The cost of debt servicing fell behind rising levels due to the low cost of borrowing. What is a classic warning sign of a bubble? Usually when I think people are borrowing to pay off their existing debts, so borrowing to service their debts. This just increases and compounds the debtor's indebtedness. How many long-term debt crises has the U.S. gone through? So I believe two. The boom of the 1920s, recession or Great Depression in the 1930s, and then boom in the early 2000s, recession in 2008. Why do debt crises usually happen? Debt crises usually happen I need sleep. I'm forgetting everything. Debt crises usually happen because of think of nothing. My mind is empty, brain dead. So we were thinking about all of these different things that affect the recessions, differentiates between recessions and depressions, and I want to say that probably the reason why debt crises usually happen is because there's a really high level of debts to income, and the cost of debt is probably pretty high as well. If not, then it's still low, but just having a high amount of leverage relative to the amount of income and spending in an economy is probably going to cause a debt crisis. Alright, there we go. Dividends related to servicing costs rise faster than incomes. Alright, need to service them. Yeah, dude, I need a break. I need sleep. So I'll be back. Just wait.